Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for a special session of Ethics Awareness Week. My name is Brian Birch, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of UVU's Center for the Study of Ethics. As part of our week-long program, our tradition has been to recognize an individual in our community with the Excellence in Ethics Award. Our first award was presented in 1994 to Michael Zimmerman, who served as Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court at the time. Since '94, we have recognized the contributions of educators, business leaders, community activists, and public officials. Last year's award was presented to Sergeant Jeremy Jameson from the Orem City Police for his outstanding work with his mental health response team. This year, we have the honor of recognizing Brittany Nystrom for her work as Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Utah. And I am joined here today by Dr. Wayne Vaught, who is the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at UVU. Welcome, Wayne.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Brian.
Under normal conditions, we would be sitting in a conference room, enjoying lunch among friends and family and VIPs. But we believed, and Brittany agreed with us, that our primary obligation lies in keeping people healthy and well. And though we are presenting this award virtually, the sincerity of our admiration and gratitude are very real. So before we have Dr. Vaught read the official citation for the award, I would like to take just a minute or two to offer a brief introduction to Brittany. Brittany, as I said, is the Executive Director of the ACLU of Utah, where she has served since 2016. Prior to this, she served as the Director of Advocacy at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service in Washington, D.C. There she advocated on behalf of refugees, unaccompanied children, immigrants in detention, and other at-risk populations. She also served as Director of Policy and Legal Affairs at the National Immigration Forum and as Legal Director at the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition. She spent several years in private practice as well in Washington as part of the litigation team at Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. Through her extensive work on immigration and refugee issues, Brittany has become a recognized national expert and has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Born on Hill Air Force Base here in Utah, Brittany is a graduate of Bonneville High School in Ogden. She holds degrees from the University of Notre Dame and Northwestern University School of Law. And finally, and most importantly for me, she serves on the Community Advisory Board for the UVU Appomattox Project, which is designed to advance ethics in public life. And the Appomattox Project is pleased to be a co-sponsor of our Ethics Awareness Week this year. So thank you, Brittany, for giving me the opportunity to work with you and become more familiar with your great work. So after Wayne reads the citation, Brittany will deliver remarks as part of her keynote address entitled Civil Liberties and Civic Virtues. So without further ado, Dr. Vaught.
Thank you so much, Brian. And Brittany, we're just really thrilled. It's quite an honor to be able, on behalf of UVU, to give you this award and this citation. You've accomplished so much, and it really is an honor to have you on campus. The Excellence in Ethics Award is presented annually by the Center for the Study of Ethics to an individual who displays exemplary ethics in their personal, their professional, and their public activities. These individuals demonstrate a rich understanding of the ethical obligations and challenges of the human condition, and they elevate ethical behavior through leadership, through civic activity, and through personal example. Furthermore, these individuals are active in writing and speaking, planning, and accomplishing activities that enhance the ethical culture of our community. Brittany, We believe that you have long exemplified ethics in public life, and that your service to our state and to our region will leave a lasting impact on our civic culture. So, on behalf of the students, of the faculty, and the administration here at Utah Valley University, we are absolutely honored to present the Excellence in Ethics Award to you this day of Wednesday, September 29th, 2021.
Rapturous applause, Brittany, all throughout cyberspace.
Well, thank you both. It is truly humbling and inspiring to hear all of those kind words. And I'm incredibly grateful, Brian, to be a part of the Appomattox project. So thank you both for making me feel so welcome and for the incredible recognition today.
Thank you. The pleasure is ours. Brittany, before you get started, I just want to remind our viewers that to the right of the video screen for most of you is a question box. So as Brittany is presenting her remarks, as you think of questions, go ahead and type them into the box. We're hoping that your questions will be succinct and respectful and productive, of course. Those will come right into us, and we will look at those in order and get them ready to serve up to Brittany once she's done. So please feel free to just fire questions away. So without further ado, Brittany, I will withdraw and turn the time to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share a PowerPoint. And hopefully that is working for everyone. So let's get started hearing a bit about civil liberties and civic virtues. I wanted to jump right in with some definitions because understanding the difference between civil rights and civil liberties is important to this conversation and something that many of us have forgotten over the years. So just right off the bat, civil rights are those rights that are guaranteed to individuals to take an action that is legally protected. And civil rights are based, for the most part, in equality, in the concept of equality. A few examples are the right to vote, the right to marry. These are legally protected actions. Civil liberties are personal freedoms. So they are restraints on the government, whereas civil right might be the duty to do something. Personal freedoms are keeping the government away from an individual. And here in our country, civil liberties are based in the Bill of Rights, so part of our Constitution. Some examples of civil liberties are the freedom from self-incrimination. That's what people mean when they say they're taking the Fifth Amendment. Freedoms from a government-imposed religion as part of the First Amendment. And we at the ACLU work to protect both civil rights and civil liberties for everyone who finds themselves in Utah. Balancing civil rights can be messy, and part of what's hard about this is that civil rights and civil liberties are at the core of our democracy. And the Bill of Rights set out a list of personal freedoms explicitly not given to the government that they were creating because they had seen in their own experience in England and over the course of history that often government was tilting away from personal freedoms and personal liberties. Finding that right balance between government responsibility and personal liberty, personal freedoms, is still sparking debate. Here we are 230 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, and we're still trying to figure out what exactly is the right balance. I want to talk today about three current issues that are more or less ripped from the headlines. I think you could find a story about each of these probably on any given day. The first is personal freedom during a pandemic. The second is policing practices and racial bias. And the third is freedom of speech and unpopular ideas. So let's start with personal freedom and rights during a pandemic. What I've put on the slide here is the ACLU's legal opinion. I'll just go ahead and read it. It's whether it's bodily integrity, personal autonomy, or religious freedom, they're all rights that are recognized in the Constitution, but they're not absolute rights. You don't have the right to inflict harm on third parties, and that's what you're doing when you refuse to take a safe and effective vaccine to a very infectious virus. That's a quote from our national legal director. What's interesting about this pandemic is that debates about masking and vaccines heavily feature the words freedom and liberty. And the right to control one's own health and physical body is maybe the quintessential example of the struggle between government responsibility here to manage an infectious and lethal disease and personal freedom. So that struggle between managing COVID-19, but retaining autonomy over personal health choices. And in fact, the ACLU's own position on vaccine mandates has evolved since 2009. Our current position was informed after speaking with many public health experts over many months and leading us to the conclusion that constitutional rights just simply don't allow a person to inflict harm on others. During COVID, maybe surprisingly, finding this balance was not for us a particularly close call, given the huge governmental interest in keeping the public safe. Legally speaking, we have seen that employers' vaccine mandates are likely to be upheld by courts, again, recognizing that strong interest in promoting public health. But the ACLU is monitoring these mandates to ensure that they don't lead to discrimination against marginalized groups. So, for example, in South Carolina and Iowa, the ACLU has filed legal challenges to states that ban mask mandates in schools. Our position is that schools must be given the tools to protect students with disabilities. That's required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, there are liberty concerns that the pandemic has spotlighted, and I don't want to downplay those. One example of those is the creation of vaccine passports that are digital records of someone's health vaccines. Those might leave behind individuals that don't have access to smartphones or smart technologies, and they definitely invite more government surveillance. Additionally, rationing of healthcare can become a disability rights concern if individuals with underlying health conditions are being denied healthcare in a crisis. So again, you're seeing lots of balancing during a pandemic between governmental power and individual rights and liberty. The takeaway here on this theme of constitutional rights during a pandemic is that the Constitution does not afford you the right to inflict harm on others. And we'll see this play out as we move through the other two issues as well. This is perhaps the most controversial and the most messy when we were talking about how messy democracy can be when striking this balance. Policing practices and racial bias. And our history has shown us that we are a nation built on and continue to be mired in racism, which does disrupt that balance between government authority and the rights of people, especially people of color. This came to a head last summer with the protests around police killings of Black men and women like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And for many of us, those protests shone a spotlight on how racism continues in our public institutions. Our history is one of violent oppression of Black men and women, people of color, Indigenous people. And it is in that context that our law enforcement agencies and our vast system of jails and prisons were created. Policing in America really comes from two roots. One is the English tradition of constables and neighborhood patrols. The second, though, is unique to America. Slave patrols were used to apprehend escaped slaves, deter slave revolts, and to discipline slaves for violating plantation rules. And enforcement of the Jim Crow laws in the South, separate but equal, enforcing the status quo by shutting down protests, also became the ancestors of our modern day law enforcement agencies. Despite the promises in the Constitution that are there to keep a check on law enforcement agencies, personal freedom and liberty, when accused of a crime, continues to be one of these areas where the ACLU is incredibly active. The protections are there. You can find them easily in our Bill of Rights. I spotlighted 3 of the amendments that most of us have heard about here on this slide. But our law enforcement agencies are now wielding enormous power. And that is putting a lot of pressure on those protections that are included in the Constitution. Are these constitutional protections working for everyone? And sadly, there are valid questions. We saw this in the protest last summer. Lots of people feeling that policing has not evolved sufficiently so that communities of color can trust the police. And under scrutiny, when looking at how police power is used, when it is used, against whom it is deployed, reveals tremendous bias against Black individuals and Indigenous individuals and people of color, including children. One example here in Utah that I wanted to share is a case that we recently settled where we represented a Black woman who was pulled over by law enforcement for allegedly failing to signal when she changed lanes. She passed several field sobriety tests, but the arresting officer insisted that she was inebriated. She agreed to go back to the station and take even additional tests, including a blood test, and was charged with a DUI, even though she professed her innocence. It was only after the blood test came back and the charges were eventually dropped that she reached out to us for help with a civil rights lawsuit. We, along with a partner firm, Holland and Hart, were able to restore her civil liberties that had been violated. She was facing charges to get her car back out of the impound lot. She had to pay a fee to restore her driver's license. She had to pay additional fees to clear her record of all of the charges that had been dropped. And statistically, this kind of racial profiling for drivers happens far more often to people of color than it does to white individuals. This slide here, I think, is really eye-opening. This is based on data from the Utah Commission for Criminal and Juvenile Justice. And what it shows is that decades of research show a systemic and nationwide presence of racial and ethnic disparities in our criminal justice system. Each of these bars represents incarceration rates for every 100,000 residents. So you can see by far Black individuals, Latinx individuals are incarcerated much more often than white individuals are. More data from the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice shows how Utah's youth population, so the first slide was US figures nationwide, this slide is specific to Utah. It shows how Utah children are treated differently at different points of contact with law enforcement. So the first bar is Utah's youth population overall. So the yellow represents white and the red represents white and the yellow represents minority. So you can see there are far more white youth than minority youth, but the white children are not represented proportionally as they move through the system. So more minority students are arrested than white students or children. More minority children are referred to court. Even more are sent to a locked detention facility. Even more are placed into some kind of community care. And the last one is the most secure facility, so the hardest type of facility. And you can see by that point in the system, you have far, far more minority children represented than their share of Utah's population. So what is that really telling us? Here it's telling us that we have a long way to go. Those promises in the Constitution about law enforcement needing to respect civil liberties, about liberty and justice for all of that has not yet been achieved. That even though those promises are there on paper, the way that law enforcement is wielding their power is not equal. That we have a criminal justice system that is tilted, that the balance has been upset. And there's fierce debate about why that is and what can be done to overturn that. What I wanted to emphasize here today is that just because we have a guarantee in the Constitution and in many of our laws that we have equal enjoyment of rights and equal enjoyment of civil liberties, that's not the reality that many Americans are experiencing. Moving to the final area that I wanted to focus on, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on this topic because I think it's of special interest to people who are in an educational setting like Utah Valley University. And it also overlaps with the first two areas as well. And this is freedom of speech and unpopular ideas. And this topic is one that many people associate with the ACLU. This is what we're honestly known for in a lot of circles, is protecting the right to free speech and the right to protest and the right to demonstrate. But again, the First Amendment is messy. It's not the easiest to interpret. And it really does illustrate when constitutional rights do not permit a person to inflict harm on others. So under the First Amendment, the government may not prohibit even horrible or hateful speech. So there are limits to what you can say. You cannot say anything that will inflict harm on others, but it does protect your right to say inflammatory or hateful things. That right exists up until the point that your speech is likely to incite harmful action. During times of turmoil in our country, unpopular speech has often been censored. It has been banned. It has been criminalized. I think I saw that this is Banned Book Week. So a timely recognition of the fact that over our 250-year history as a country, we have really struggled to live up to the ideals of the First Amendment. Perhaps one of the darkest periods of our history that I hope many of us remember is McCarthyism. And that really showed the power of the government and what it might feel like when freedom of speech begins to be curtailed. In that era, punishments were handed down for individuals suspected of being communists. Prior to that, you have a whole history in our nation of the Postal Service not delivering mail that promoted the Communist Party or anarchist ideas. You have people being imprisoned for saying things at labor union rallies, promoting the rights of workers. One of the ACLU's most famous cases happened in Skokie, Illinois, where we, to the surprise of many people, actually defended the Nazis and fought for their right to peacefully march, the keyword being peaceful, in a parade in Illinois through the town of Skokie, which was not coincidentally, a town where large numbers of Jewish Holocaust survivors lived. So many of our members quit in protest. They were just outraged that we would stand up for the rights of the Nazi Party. But looking at our principles, an organization that promotes civil rights and civil liberties, this was a peaceful protest. It was absolutely unpopular speech, hate speech even, but we here in the United States have decided through the First Amendment that protecting the rights of even speech that we find distasteful is incredibly important. Over the years, we as the ACLU gained many, many more members than we lost. As people tell us over and over again, they joined after Skokie, Illinois, because they saw that it was important to support an organization that, even though it might be distasteful and hateful, we do need to stand up against the government when they are trying to censor speech. So that brings us to a more recent example of controversy around the freedom of speech. Conduct that is threatening, that is harassing, that is intimidating is not protected, even if words are used. So Charlottesville is an example of where this balance between government power and constitutional protections played out in a very public way. And whether that balance was found correctly continues to be debated today. In Charlottesville, a group called Unite the Right was rallying to protect the statue of Robert E. Lee from being taken down. The protesters claimed they were there to peacefully demonstrate, to peacefully exercise their First Amendment rights. But that's not how it played out. I think we all know that this protest ended with the death of one of the counter protesters when one of the Unite the Right supporters drove a car into a crowd of people. And this raised really valid questions about what freedoms of speech should we support? Does everyone have equal access to the right to protest and speak? Should white supremacists have equal opportunity? And what about the counter protesters? Should they have equal opportunity? A lot of debate has happened around power dynamics. So here you have white individuals literally carrying torches, marching through a town in Virginia that was the seat of slaveholding in Virginia. And then you had a lot of minority protesters. And the conversation that was sparked by Charlottesville really calls into question, can people of color, can minorities really exercise their First Amendment rights the same way that Black individuals, Indigenous individuals, people of color can exercise their rights? And I think the answer to that is probably not. That the police respond differently. As we talked about, there are different types of interactions between minority populations and white people. You have different access to other kinds of power in our country, to wealth, to elected officials. There is not yet equal power when you're looking at wealth distribution or who holds public office. That's heavily tilted towards white Americans. That doesn't mean that the actions those people are taking are necessarily biased, but it should be talked about. It should be questioned. So that's what I wanted to evoke here, was this continuing conversation around, do we think as Americans that everyone should have the freedom to say even really horrible things? The ACLU clearly does think that, but I think with with an overlapping conversation, understanding the racial dynamics in our country as well. So this is a slide that I think is incredibly timely for today, and one that could be a hour-long conversation on its own. Talking about what rights exist in the classroom and what, both for the student and for the teacher. And that has to do with what can you say out loud in a classroom? What can you wear on a t-shirt in a classroom? What can teachers put up on a poster, or what flags can they hang in a classroom? And this is a question that has been up to the Supreme Court and back down over and over and over again. We do not have all the answers in this area yet. It continues very, very much to play out all around us constantly. In fact, just a few months ago in June, the Supreme Court came out with an opinion exactly on this topic. They were looking at the question of when can a school discipline a student, in this case, a high school student, for speech that took place off campus. So in this case, a teenager used Snapchat to share some obscenities as to her feelings on the cheerleading team that she had just been cut from, on the softball team that she didn't make, in her school in general. So she put out some obscenities on Snapchat. Unfortunately for her, the mom of one of her friends happened to be the cheerleading coach and saw this, and the school was not happy at all with this student's speech. So they took disciplinary action against her for what she had said about the cheerleading squad, the softball team in her school. This went all the way up to the US Supreme Court to decide, is that a violation of this teenager's First Amendment rights to speak freely? What the Supreme Court found was kind of murky. They said, in this case, the school district probably had gone too far. She hadn't said anything that was disrupting a classroom. She hadn't threatened anybody. She wasn't making terroristic comments. She wasn't bullying another individual student. They left open what all of the contours might be around when a school might take discipline for off-campus speech. But what it did was show us that this conversation continues to evolve. As new technology emerges, things like Snapchat that disappear in 24 hours, other kinds of apps that let an individual student speak to thousands and thousands of people on social media, that line between off campus and on campus, as we're all virtually in communication anyway. These are all questions that will continue to be thought through and debated, I'm sure, for years to come. Bringing this conversation back to Utah, we have several conversations happening right now about freedom of speech and unpopular ideas in the K through 12 setting. You might have seen recently, there is one school district in Davis County that is apparently banning all flags. So they have come out with less than clear prohibitions, apparently, on pride flags, on Black Lives Matter flags. When pressed, they said, oh, no, we're banning all flags. Don't worry about it. The only thing we're going to have is the US flag and the Utah state flag. That raises some real questions about what is a flag? Is it disruptive? What is political speech? Is the pride flag supporting a political viewpoint, or is it just showing support for LGBTQ students who attend that school? Same question around Black Lives Matter. Is this a political speech question, or are we just showing support for students of color? So there are lots of questions around what it means to have a flag displayed in your classroom, what it means to apply equally a rule prohibiting flags. We could easily imagine one instance where one teacher has a flag that is other than the US flag or the Utah state flag, and that is permitted or no action is taken. But then another teacher down the hall might have a different flag, and someone complains about that, and that flag is taken down. So uneven application of rules like this is something that the ACLU is looking out for. And then also recognizing that students do have a right to be welcomed in a classroom. This has been another line of Supreme Court cases that very strongly clarifies students have a right to equal education. All students, not just majority students, but all students need to be welcomed, including students with disabilities, students with different language needs, students with different educational needs. There needs to be a welcoming and an equal environment for everyone. Other examples of freedom of speech and unpopular ideas playing out in a school have to do with this really fascinating conversation that's going on around critical race theory. And this is where some of the intersectionality with racial bias is popping up in a classroom. Teachers clearly are required by their school district to follow the curriculum that has been approved. Teachers are not permitted to say whatever they want without having that approved by the school district. But in the question of critical race theory, which, to be fair, it does not exist in any K through 12 curriculum currently, there's a real concern that teachers will find their speech being chilled, that they might rush through the history lesson on slavery in America, or they might skirt issues in current events having to do with a Black Lives Matter protest or talking about Charlottesville. Maybe it feels to them too complicated or too dangerous. They wouldn't want to get in trouble since critical race theory is under the magnifying glass these days. So all of these concepts and questions do overlap. The questions of pandemic is popping up in schools, as I touched on. There are lawsuits out there questioning the authority of school districts to prohibit masks, for states to say no school district can ban masks. That has a huge implication on students with disabilities who might not be able to go to school if all of their classmates are unmasked. So just wanted to point out that each of these issues does overlap with another in a very real and very powerful way. As a takeaway, history has shown us that in times like ours, where social unrest and national stress are high, these are the moments where it's pivotal to find that balance between individual freedoms and government power. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. We are very much reckoning with racial inequity in our history as a country and many, many other social divisions. It is not at all surprising that we are finding this balance to be unsettled, and that this debate is raging around liberties and freedoms and government power and whose rights are being violated. This debate can be and should be healthy. It's what the founding fathers talked about when building into the Constitution a way to amend it, a way to update it and make it current for the evolving times. But this kind of debate can also solidify divisions and really lead to alienation. And we're seeing this happen more and more too, where it almost feels like you have one side of a debate over here, the other side is over here. They're not talking to each other or listening to each other. They're just talking in kind of a parallel manner. We here at the ACLU will continue to fight for the rights and the liberties of everyone living in or passing through Utah. We are here to make sure that the Bill of Rights, that the Constitution, that our state laws protecting civil rights and civil liberties have power and have meaning and aren't just gathering dust on the books. We're also committed to empowering everyone to exercise their own rights and their own liberties. We know that we can't be there when every time we're needed, but by sharing information like this and reminding people of their rights, we hope that one day individuals will be more empowered to exercise those rights. And honestly, everyone listening here today can play a part in promoting that and acknowledging the racial bias that is baked into our law enforcement system by thinking through what are the balances to be struck during a pandemic, by understanding why anyone would stand up for the right of people saying despicable things. We can all play a part in making sure that our constitutional rights mean something and are not encroached upon as our government and our country continues to go through some really stressful, very disruptive times. As a conclusion, I just wanted to throw up here our website. You can follow us on social media. We are open to people reaching out to us for help. If you have a civil rights or a civil liberties issue, or you're looking for information, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can become a member. You can come to some of our events and learn more about us. But truly, we are here for exactly this kind of conversation, to think through all of the issues of the day and always standing for the civil rights and the civil liberties of all.
Thank you, Brittany. That was terrific. Much to think about and a lot of things for us to be able to take back and discuss with our students in our classrooms. You mentioned balance. And so I'm interested in you taking us into the boardroom of ACLU in terms of how you prioritize and how you select cases to take up. What are the criteria? What's the texture of the conversation like?
Oh, that's a great question, Brian. So we do have far more people reach out to us than we can help. So we are constantly looking for the right priorities and going back to our case selection process. Our number one criterion is, will an individual case impact a large number of people? So that case that I referenced where a driver was pulled over for what very much felt like a racially biased stop and the conduct that happened afterwards, we hoped that by taking that case and winning and encouraging that particular police department to adopt better training, to compensate her for what she went through, the other police departments would go on to change their practices. So impact is a huge concern. Does the individual have access to other places that can be helpful? So we will refer many people to the Disability Law Center or to Equality Utah or the Utah Pride Center. We look for other partner organizations that can maybe be a more immediate source of help for that individual. And then a newer consideration that we have is, does a case align with our values? So really trying to ensure that we continue to speak and to fight in a way that is welcoming to all Utahns.
Thank you. That actually is a good lead into a question that came in from our website. It says, what unique challenges does the Utah chapter of the ACLU face? And what local factors make your work easier or harder?
Yeah, that's a packed full question. Utah is unique in lots of ways, some that make it a great place to develop civil rights work, and others that make it a real drag, honestly. Some unique challenges that we have are empowerment issues. So we have a healthy indigenous population, for example, here in the state, but those individuals aren't always at the table. So you can say the same for women. We have a decent proportion of women in the legislature, but probably not representative. That sadly probably is not all that unique to Utah. But some of the challenges that we've faced over the years have had to do with the interplay between religious freedom and liberty and constitutional rights. So I'm thinking of one case in particular where we were really opposed to the LDS Church taking over part of Main Street. And as part of the protest to that, there was a kiss-in where a lot of same-sex couples engaged in public displays of affection to show some of the conduct that they would not be able to engage in if it was a church-owned area rather than a public street. So that certainly is kind of in the background of Utah politics. Sometimes, though, that makes our work easier. So thinking back to a few years back when many other Republican-controlled states were speaking out against welcoming Syrian refugees, and you had this kind of backlash. We don't want these people here. Utah's governor was the only Republican governor that said, we want Syrian refugees. We are a state with a history of people fleeing religious persecution, and we want to honor that by welcoming refugees to our state. So on that issue, on immigrant and refugee issues, Utah has an amazing welcoming posture that has been honestly really, really easy to work with.
Thank you. That's great. I don't think or I can't think in my career of a time where it was easier to teach the challenges related to civil liberties and civic virtues. I don't know what that says about our current situation now, but there's certainly a lot of issues that are ripe for discussion and complex and challenging and lend themselves to the kind of balance that you talked about in your presentation. Sadly, Brittany, we're out of time, given the constraints of our class schedule. From everyone here at UVU, as Wayne Vaught stated in the citation, we want to thank you for your career of service, for all of your efforts on behalf of the ACLU of Utah, and I look forward to working with you on the Appomattox project going forward. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So that wraps it up.